I'm going to start with a quick story. This winter, I had to go down into storage to check on something for the O'Keeffe exhibition. I walked way over to the Art and Nature Center, took the big freight elevators down, entered my code through the big metal doors which slammed shut behind me, flicked on the fluorescent lights, and in the corner of the room, leaning against the wall, was the freshly uncrated T.C. Cannon painting that you see here. It took my breath away. I had never heard of T.C. Cannon before arriving at the Peabody Essex Museum, and I had never seen one of his works in person before that moment. It was so colorful, it was so incredible. I immediately raced over and started taking pictures on my iPhone. I started studying the colors and the textures, the technique. The scale was so impressive. It's over 4 feet high and about 4 feet wide. And as I looked more closely, I started to get really frustrated. I thought, how is it possible that a modern painting this extraordinary is completely unknown to me? I'm someone who has a doctorate in art history. I have studied American art, and it just so strongly resonated with the traditions of American portrait, which I did know, and which are very familiar to me. And the painting, as you can probably guess here, so clearly demonstrates Cannon's ambitious engagement with the traditions of portraiture practiced by the likes of John Singleton Copley or John Singer Sargent or Thomas Eakins, canonical American painters that are taught in every American art survey and always prominently displayed in every major American museum's American art collection, including PEMS. So, however, as I continued to look further and I kind of shared my impressions later with Karen and Rachel, I learned that all my first assumptions about the painting were completely wrong. I thought the sitter was a woman. I have since learned that the bear claw necklace worn by the figure signals that the sitter is a man. I thought the decoration painted in the bust area might be the elaborate bodice of a dress. I linked these visual cues with the sitter's earrings and paisley sleeves flounced by a fancy armband. I read this portrait in this erroneous way, not only because I'm ignorant of a lot of Native American dress and histories, but also because I was reading it in the ways I was familiar with reading conventional sort of United States American portraits. And I even thought that it did resemble a little bit the Copley and PEM's own collection, Mrs. Sarah Irving Waldo. So this paper is going to kind of explore a reading of these two pictures. And before I go into more detail of who and what these portraits actually represent, I want to first examine the boundaries of the art historical canon that I'm going to argue are important to blur in order to comparatively explore these representations. First, what should our working definition of the canon be? I'm glad that Janet referenced the 1996 Bulletin article. I decided to experiment with a more kind of populist definition, if you will, what definitions non-specialists might come to if they were searching online. So searching for the word canon doesn't actually get you to canons of art. It gets you to like Canon cameras and other things. But canon of art history lands a top search result in Google from the National Gallery of Art in London. They define the art historical canon as, quote, the conventional timeline of artists who are sometimes considered old masters or great artists. And those are in quotes. Today's art history attempts to question these rules of greatness, considering issues of gender, race, class, and geography, among others. The NGA definition acknowledges the contested nature of the canon that we all live and implies that it is exclusive, which it is. We all know artists who are great, like T.C. Cannon, have been excluded. What even are the criteria for greatness? Who determines? I played around with additional search terms and observed the terms suggested in the browser search box. Another notable definition this process led me to was Western canon in Wikipedia, defined as the body of books, music, and art that scholars generally accept as the most important and influential in shaping Western culture. So then I thought, if you detach the word Western from canon and culture in this wiki definition, you actually arrive at some general guiding principles I would be interested in employing. the body of art that scholars generally accept as the most important and influential in shaping culture. This adapted definition acknowledges the role of a great artist like Canon, like Copley, in shaping and potentially reshaping American culture. It implies that scholars reinforce the canon in our classrooms and museums every day, but it also suggests that we are the ones who do the work of canon formation and reformation. An experimental method for doing this art historically is that of collapsing boundaries through scholarly and museological juxtapositions. Such pairings have the potential to expand the timeline and geographies for studying American artists and their aims, and to examine the construction and subversion of American art traditions in order to erode boundaries between them. Such frameworks as Native and American could be reactivated to engage marginalized narratives of American art and history. At PEM, we would be able to question as well as reactivate these art historical categories by actually displaying our Copley and our Canon together in the museum's galleries. The prospect of displaying these two portraits together, an unprecedented pairing, prompted me to indulge in playing with the homophone canon, and the ramifications of the two versions of this word in this context, of the words in this context. With a word like Indian with beaded headdress, T.C. Canon wasn't just inserting himself and his painting into the American art canon, as represented by the likes of Copley. With his art and his name and his identity, he was blasting it wide open. Because he is Kato Kiowa, this was not just a stylistic exercise as it might have been for a non-native male modern contemporary painter. Canon shouldn't and doesn't need Copley to become part of the canon. However, at PEM, we would like to make this comparison to illuminate more evocatively how he grappled with and reimagined multiple conventions, histories, and traditions of portraiture simultaneously to create a critical and imaginative space for reconceiving what an American portrait has been, what it is, and indeed, as I will suggest when I conclude, what it can be. When we finalize the completely new installations of the museum's Native/American collections, we would like to use comparison and juxtaposition to bring Canon's imaginative space into being. We have not yet developed the interpretive methods for how our audiences would compare and contrast these works and what that experience would be like in the galleries. However, we might hope to guide them to see the differences as well as the similarities and connections between these two figures, both posed for posterity by the artists. Both figures are situated in slightly artificial settings in nature, a convention Canon pushes to delightful extremes with his bubblegum wad, pale pink clouds, and trees encircling the headdress and face, the electric blue sky, and acid green grass. The red silk that Copley cascades from an architectural element was typical of grand manner portraits that he saw in British prints he routinely referenced as compositional sources. Canon takes down that drapery and uses it as an element of beauty and practicality, a blanket warmly enveloping his elderly sitter. Copley found inspiration in 18th century British prints for his portraits of specific individuals. Canon very likely looked to 19th century photographs of Native American leaders taken by white photographers to reclaim these images for his own grand manner paintings. While a fair amount is known about Mrs. Sarah Irving Waldo, and I'm not going to go into those histories in this paper, the Indian with auto fur and beaded headdress resists specific identification. He likely represents a composite of different plains Indians. The headdress is similar to ones worn by the otter fur headdress is similar to ones worn by Black Crow leaders. Pawnee, Oto, and Omaha men wear bear claw necklaces as emblems of their achievements and leadership roles. Caitlin Cooper, Cherokee, in the object entry she wrote about the Canon painting for this exhibition catalog, describes the attire of the elder warrior as a Southern straight dance ensemble. Even though we can identify some of the dress, Canon refuses our impulse to identify a sitter. He casts the eyes of the figure into shadow, obscuring them and prohibiting us from meeting the gaze of this distinguished man. Perhaps imagining an audience accustomed to viewing portraits created within an oppressor culture, Canon denies a direct engagement with his imaginary sitter by hiding the eyes from us. We can't see or know him, as the white photographers who created the images he referenced didn't truly see or know him. Instead, he pushes this boldly and brightly attired man flat up against the picture plane, enlarging the body so that it appears to be almost pressing against us in time and space. In a different manner, Copley's sitter also escapes our direct encounter across time. He demurely averted Mrs. Waldo's eyes. Yet through his rendering of perspective and materials, the sense of the real, it is through those things that Copley lures us to gaze across the highly polished mahogany tea table and admire her loveliness. We are invited to luxuriate in the display of her lavish silks and laces and marvel at his technical skill in rendering them. Thanks to Caitlin Cooper's interpretation of the canon painting in the exhibition catalog, I allowed myself to have a more imaginative experience of the works, one that supported my interest in opening up pathways for viewers between them. Cooper observes, quote, the time glitch that Canon created by combining the traditional regalia and references to 19th century photographs with the seating, a modern aluminum lawn chair. And then she creates her own time glitch. She imagines Canon's Indian as one of her community members today, bringing their own lawn chairs, markered with their names on them, to sit and watch and wait to perform their dances. She can even, quote, smell grandma's permanent marker in the air. That final sensory detail of her entry is breathtaking. It leaps gracefully from art history to creative writing to make the painting come alive, not just for her, but for us. Cooper's prose also demonstrates a kind of art historical writing based in the experience of the scholar viewing the work that art historian Alexander Nemiroff advocates for in the most recent volume of the Terra Foundation essay series published in 2017, Experience. In his introduction to Experience, Nemiroff notes that, quote, although scholars write, they do not write, because writers are understood to have some greater connection to the imagination and to language itself as a fluid and inventive medium, end quote. He goes on to describe his desire to engage in the process of, quote, writing it to the point of seeing what you say and vice versa, of creating a moment of mysterious directness, a moment that subsides and endures, that is sudden but prolonged, much like the sitter in her chair. It is a sense, crucially for the historian, of having answered to the past or of having heard it in some absurd but important way, so that the hard and sharp and soft and nearly invisible feelings and failings of a moment on earth long ago might appear transmuted, resurrected, in the consciousness of a sensitive observer from afar. One the painting even seems to intuit will be out there. No serious artists really ever think of making something for their own time only. Art history, in such a conception, becomes distinctly more than a belated elaboration of works of art. The description of pictures becomes a response to them. Such a description aspires to make the work present, end quote. It is Cooper's mirroring of Canon's time glitch that made me look again at the cherry branch in Mrs. Waldo's hand. Our history tells us that in the 18th century, as Carrie Rabora and Paul Stady have discussed, quote, Copley used flowers and fruits as gendered objects that express feminine accomplishment, not unlike the bear claw and the headdress signifying the male accomplishments in Canon's painting. They were to be understood as the product of a woman's discipline, science, handiwork, and character. Quote, women did not merely grow fruits and flowers, they reared them as they did children. But in light of Cooper and Nemiroff and our experiment to compare Copley and Canon, I looked anew at that cherry branch, wondered at how fresh it looked, as if it had just been cut yesterday, and how she might extend it out to us to appreciate its perfection. And I imagined being able to reach out and touch the cool metal of the Indian's aluminum chair as if there in that fantasy landscape. This tactile imagining across time and cultures made evident to me an American truth, that both these artists used the formal language of portraiture and their artistic prowess to reveal not just the most significant members of their communities, but the values that constitute those communities. Experiencing these works together is not just an academic exercise in expanding the American canon. Experiencing these works together could get us to think more deeply and more creatively about who we are and what we value and why and when. I want to conclude with another kind of time glitch. Amy Sherrod's landmark portrait of Michelle Obama for the National Portrait Gallery made famous, among other things, the museum's triennial Outwin Buchever portrait competition. In 2016, Sherrod won that competition, and her achievement instantly elevated her into a group of canonical contemporary American painters that the Obamas considered for their official commission. The definitions of portraiture used by the Portrait Gallery to solicit submissions to this contemporary exhibition offers another lens through which we can understand the significance of Canon's Indian with beaded headdress. The NPG invites artists across the United States to, quote, broaden the definition of portraiture. They are now inviting submissions for 2019. The current call for participation on the NPG website states, quote, in the past, the Outwin Buchever portrait composition has solicited products of direct encounters between artists and sitters. For the upcoming 2019 installment, however, the Portrait Gallery also welcomes indirect encounters, such as portraits that employ appropriated or ready-made imagery as a means of responding to history. The competition also seeks conceptual portraits that utilize archival research to challenge and engage the social and political landscape of our time, end quote. 40 years ago, Canon did this. Just imagine, if Canon submitted Indian with beaded headdress to the NPG now, I bet he would win. Thank you.